Our desire with Common Practice is to provide a weekly check-in point where we can come together and connect as a network to share best practices on how we can shepherd the church in these uncertain times. This week, our topic is pastors as frontline care providers. And as I've been in conversation with pastors in our network, we know that care needs among your congregation and your community are skyrocketing with every day that goes by. I don't know if you saw the weekly jobless claim numbers that came out this week, actually just today, but that number jumped to 6.6 million people. That's double from last week's number, which was already by far a record. And I imagine that the people that you're interacting with, people that you know and love, they're facing difficult choices about bills that are coming due. Some may be facing food insecurity, housing challenges, potentially medical challenges, mental health concerns. And while there are a number of organizations out there that are doing fantastic work to help in each of those areas, for many people, the church might be their very first touch point. It's the first place that they're going to either look for help or where they can be pointed in the right direction. So it's really important that we come together as a network and learn from one another and think together how the church can be serving on the front lines during this crisis. And we know that there are 100 ways that a church might step in to serve their congregation and the surrounding community. But today we wanted to talk with 4 different pastors and church staff to hear how they're responding in their unique ways. And whether you're a pastor today in your role or whether you're just connected and provide leadership in your church, hopefully as they're sharing these ideas, it can spur creative thinking in your context. Our 4 panelists are going to be first Bill Gorman. He's the campus pastor at Christ Community Church here in Kansas City. Cami Bethay, she's the director of missional living at Christ Presbyterian Church in Nashville. Charles Cheek, who is connected with a church and is also the community networking director for the Peninsula Baptist Association. It's an association of 63 churches in the Hampton Roads area. And then also Jim Mullins, who's the campus pastor at Redemption Church, Tempe, Arizona. And each of them have responded in very different ways depending on their context and just the ways that their church is organized. We also realize that there are many of you listening, probably most of you, that have taken really creative and bold steps to serve on the front lines at this time. And we want to also hear from you, your ideas. So as you look kind of in the bottom section of your Zoom window, there's a little chat feature. And that's the place to post comments, to post questions of our panelists, and any ideas, things that you're doing, ways that you're serving on the front lines. We'd love to hear from you. So do use that chat feature in the bottom section of your Zoom window. In fact, I'd love for us to start with a question. And again, you can just respond by typing in your answer, and we're going to be reading off a few of those right away. But what are the prominent key care needs that you're facing right now? Or maybe that you're hearing about in your church or community? Obviously, there's lots of things going on, but what are the chief care needs that you're hearing from people around you or in your community right now? I know I've been thinking about family members or people that I know, friends, people connected through church. Sometimes it's job loss, sometimes it's job insecurity, or even hours that have been pared back. And there's just a lot of questions about how people are going to do things like pay bills or just some of their obligations that they have. So those needs are really present. Just looking towards the chat feature and seeing what those messages are. And here's what some of you said. Colby says that just connectedness. People are feeling like they're isolated. They can't connect to one another, and sort of a mental health category. But as humans, we were created to connect. Fishertown pastor says that funerals and separation from loved ones in nursing care. So as people are either dying from the virus or in other ways, in a lot of cases, not even able to have a funeral or to be present for that. Just a huge grieving. Damian Cheater says just uncertainty in general. Just people don't know what to do with unanswered questions. Luke says we have elderly membership So people are lonely, but they're also facing their fears, not knowing if this virus will come to them. Ruth says financial concerns due to job loss. Several people said connectedness. So these are things that we know, but just to restate the obvious that this is really a time of severe challenge for a lot of people. Gail says, children are home from school and parents are overwhelmed because they might have a job where they can work from home, but how do you manage to sort of care for kids during that time? So we're going to come back to these comments in a little bit, but we want to start off with our panelists and hear the unique ways that they're responding as kind of the front lines of care. So our first panelist that we're going to go to is Bill Gorman, campus pastor of Christ Community Church. And as I learned about what he was doing to kind of respond to his congregation, I thought this is a story that we want to share. So Bill, would you walk us through some of the steps that you've taken?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this today. And yeah, when we, as like I'm sure all of you, a big part of what we do as pastors is see a bunch of our congregation every Sunday morning and get to catch up with them, hear how they're doing, shake hands, give hugs, those kinds of things. And once we realize we're not going to be able to do that, how do we engage our people, find out how they're doing, and check in on them? And I was reading an article. I'm going to try to share my screen and see if you guys can see a couple of these things. But there was a couple of things that I read this article by Andy Crouch called Love in the Time of Coronavirus, which is a great piece. But one of the things that he mentions there is a link to the Wheaton Center for Humanitarian Disaster Institute. And so I'd followed that link and began kind of looking at some of the things that they suggest doing in any disaster. And they had this idea, which just captured my imagination, called spiritual first aid. And it was just a 2 or 3 page PDF. And it was so helpful. And they talked about this blessed method of helping to care for people in crisis in kind of these categories of belonging, livelihood, emotion, spirituality, and safety. And then when you're dealing with people who are in crisis, that you need to check in on them in those categories. And so that kind of sparked my imagination. And I got together with my staff team and just said, what if we built a list of everyone who's attended our campus at least 3 times, and basically since the first of the year, and just called every single person and asked them questions about those 5 key areas. And so we built out a list and we tried to identify. I'll just show you kind of a quick look at that. This is just a Google sheet that we exported our database to. And we put different colors, so high concern, moderate concern, low concern. So people in that high concern category were folks who are older, might be more vulnerable to the virus, people who work in healthcare, who we know might be in an industry that would be particularly hard hit by the economy in this moment. And so we just started prioritizing, calling them, taking notes, and seeing how we might follow up with them. And basically our process then, as I just crafted a few questions around those ideas. And so we would just call and ask questions about how are you and your family doing? That's that kind of belonging question. Then kind of moving into asking questions about just how are you experiencing God in the midst of all this? Are you experiencing God in the midst of all this? Kind of getting at that spiritual question. How is this affecting you financially? Are you healthy? That kind of safety piece. Just kind of walking through, not necessarily in a systematic 1, 2, 3 with every one of those questions, but through the course of that conversation, trying to touch on all 5 of those key areas. And it has been just an absolute blessing, both I think to us as pastoral leaders. I've found that even when those calls are hard, I've left every one of those calls feeling just energized and filled up and more connected. But I think it's meant the world to the people that we've been contacting. And so I have a few stories about that here in just a moment. But it was really good to be able to walk through and talk with those people in our congregation on that. And I think it's been really, really meaningful. We've ended those calls with prayer, followed up with an email to that person as well with some links to how they can request help and receive help through our website, or even offer help if that's something that they'd like to do. They can do that through our website. So that's kind of what we're doing, tracking through that. I'll stop sharing my screen here and come back to you this way. But I just wanted to share, because our whole staff team has been involved in this. And so I wanted to share a few stories from them of kind of their experiences. I asked them this week, what have been some of the moments that have been really key for you as you've talked with people? And I'll read this to you. Holly, one of our staff members, said this. It's been great. The issues we're getting into, anxiety, how to witness in this time, trusting God with health and finances, are far more deep conversations than I typically have with these folks on a Sunday or at a church event. And they're asking about me too, she says, helping me talk through the hardships of this time. It's so mutually encouraging. One couple even spent time praying for me, and it was the sweetest moment. Made me go from just knowing them as faithful volunteers to really loving them and feeling their genuine care for me and my family. Another thing that Holly mentioned just is about the benefit of this. She leads a lot of our adult ministries. She says, I'm often asking people, will you volunteer? Will you lead? Will you organize an event? She says, in these calls, I don't have to woo anyone to any kind of action. It's just care and concern with no strings attached. It's love that these relationships, it feels less transactional. And she just talks about the benefit of that. So it's been a great way to touch literally now hundreds of people in our congregation in a real personal way, find out what they need, connect them with someone to go shopping for them if they're older and they don't want to get out, or begin to connect them with benevolence dollars if they need help paying a bill, those kind of things. So I'll leave it there, Matt, but that's kind of what we're doing here at Christ Community.
Yeah, I love that. And I think we've shared that link with our kind of everyone that's joining in on the call, both to the Andy Crouch article and to the Wheaton page. And that's really a great little list of categories there, just bless and belonging and livelihood and those different categories, safety, emotional. So, and you've crafted questions around those, just a line for each of those, correct? That you're asking people. So
that's right. Yeah.
How are you and your family doing? For safety, do you feel safe at this time? Do you have any financial needs? And then you're just making note of that.
Yep.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Well, thank you, Bill. Our next panelist that we're going to hear from is Cami Bethay, and she's the Director of Missional Living and Outreach at Christ Presbyterian in Nashville. And Cami, walk us through some of the things that you've been doing at your church to try to equip your people with resources.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, for inviting me to be a part of today's conversation. Like Bill just shared, we at Christ Pres have a care team, a care staff that has really reached out with a lot of the same ways that he has in pursuing specific people by phone, checking in with folks. And through that process, really in the last week, we became aware of more and more people who were, for the very first time in their lives, being furloughed and being laid off. And it just so happens that I grew up in Atlanta, and for years I have followed a money expert podcast, a guy named Clark Howard out of Atlanta, who's got about 1 million downloads per month. And last weekend, when I was cleaning up around the house, I decided to go ahead and listen to last Saturday and Sunday's episodes. And this was just on the heels of Friday's vote passing the $2 trillion stimulus bill. And this particular podcast is a call-in show, but Clark's been doing this with America basically for 30 years, answering really complicated questions and making it super simple. So the more I listened, the more I became aware that this 800-page document was something that was going to really uniquely affect churches, congregations, and employees and employers all across the country. And so I've been working with our communications team to try to get some of these links posted on our website. But the long and short of it is that I was hearing from many of our nonprofits and our small business owners in complete panic about layoffs and downsizing the number of employees and April 1st rent being due, et cetera, et cetera. And what I learned about the stimulus bill was that almost immediately, in the course of the next 10 days to 2 weeks, small nonprofits and small businesses defined as businesses with less than 500 employees, which is a pretty generous definition of a small business, will have the capacity to apply for up to $10 million in loans, which would essentially give them, if it's documented, the ability to get fully reimbursed for 8 weeks of payroll, rent and mortgage, and utility payments in their small businesses and their nonprofits, if that's documented and if they're approved for these loans. And so just even understanding the scope of that was pretty interesting. Also began to learn about the number of companies that are hiring, and I'll just give you a few that were mentioned and that I heard about last weekend. Amazon's hiring 100,000 people with increased demand and has raised their salary to a minimum $17 an hour. Dollar General is hiring 25,000 people. Domino's adding 10,000 workers. Lowe's hiring 30,000 additional employees this week, with an $80 million in bonuses being offered to those that are being hired. And the list goes on and on. Clark.com, which is where a lot of this information is parked, and we borrowed it and sort of brought it over to our website and gave credit where credit is due, lists these 17 companies that are hiring thousands of employees right now. And also he goes into detail with a good portion of what's offered. For example, every American is going to receive a one-time check of $1,200 rather soon, with also $500 per child. And that's for individuals making less than $75,000 a year, couples making less than $150,000 a year. In addition, there'll be unemployment assistance that's an additional $600 per week on top of whatever state benefits are made available. There's also a 6-month loan suspension. So all federal student loans are going to be basically suspended through September. Does not apply to private student loans, but that's a bit of a breather for those that are working on paying back federal student loans. And then there's, like I said, additional opportunities for small businesses and nonprofits to go through what I think is SBA.com. I'm not 100% certain that that's the website, but there's a way that you do this through the Small Business Administration, and it's all becoming more clear. All of this was passed last Friday, a little shy of a week ago, and so it's still in the works in terms of next steps. But what I have found has been really encouraging for the church as a whole across the country, but particularly here in Nashville, is that we have pastors, we have members of our care team, and we have small business owners, and we have nonprofit leaders who were coming to us in a panic. And when they begin to learn some of the workings of what this $2 trillion stimulus bill is going to offer in the next couple of weeks, it just allows for there to be a little bit less pressure and a little bit less stress. And so we've also had very practical ways in Nashville encouraging our members, our small groups, our families, if they're getting out and want to do something, to find our local food pantries, because we had the Nashville tornadoes that hit across about a 50-mile span through Nashville and a little bit east of Nashville. That was March the 3rd, which was, very soon after then the COVID-19 restrictions and social isolation and so forth. So our city has had, a double whammy with the tornado and the COVID. And then we're a city that has so many nonprofits that are based out of Nashville, and a lot of our nonprofits have their annual fundraiser in April. And so in the world that I live in, which is really focused on nonprofits and local ministries, everybody's kind of talking about the triple whammy. There was a tornado, then there's COVID-19, and then these annual fundraisers that nonprofits depended on for a good portion of their annual fundraising have been tabled, canceled, probably postponed, but probably postponed till early fall. And so that really has been restricting, and it's really been stressful. It's really been hard. Board members calling me and nonprofit executive directors calling me saying, y'all are a big church. What do you know? And how can you encourage us and help us? And we've given out some emergency funding. The other thing we did was we have a budgeted amount that goes to all the nonprofits that we financially support each month. And we, this last week, offered to our local nonprofits, if it would help them, we might be able to pay out their amount that they've already been budgeted for April, May, and June, but doing that in advance. And so we've only had, I think, 3 nonprofits that have responded and said, you know what, actually with our cash flow situation right now, our crisis, that would be a huge help if you guys could go ahead and give us, instead of giving it once a month, it's basically April, May, and June's financial support in one lump sum. And so those checks are going out next week. So there's lots of ways we're trying to faithfully and creatively look at the situations and figure out how we can be of encouragement, certainly be of prayer, but also practically speaking, help nonprofits know what's out there, because nobody's really going to sit down and read an 800-page stimulus bill, I don't think.
Yeah, I really love that, Cammie. And it's just, we assume that a lot of small business owners are aware of the legislation that's passing, but having quick links on your website or in some reference can be a really great aid. I also love that you posted the top 17 companies that are hiring. I feel like as pastors, someone on our team should know that stat, whether it's the top 10 in your city or the top 5, or and obviously there are some risks that come with taking a job at this time for certain groups of people, but to know where those opportunities are is really key. And I just saw in the Wall Street Journal just today, there was an article on it, kind of went company by company, which are hiring, which are giving bonuses, et cetera. So those can be great resources. Thank you so much, Cammie. We're going to go now to Charles Cheek in Hampton Roads. And Charles, you saw some needs in your community that some of the social services were breaking down or not able to support all that they could. And you and your connection with 63 other churches in your area stepped up to the plate. Can you tell us of how you responded?
Sure. Actually, the front part of the story is we had been interacting with the homeless population prior to the virus and the shelter in place orders came about. And by doing that, we had built up this rapport. So when all of this started happening, our heart certainly poured out to that population. It was now tossed out in the street because the shelters closed early and the day centers that they utilized were closed. So they were just told to go to the streets and shelter in place. Where? So immediately we kind of joined forces with a couple of our folks from the city government and said, what are we going to do? And the immediate need was that we identified that we need to keep folks nourished and also give them comfortable items like blankets and sleeping bags and so forth. So we just started with a trip to Walmart, 3 of us, and from there we did a Facebook Live, and the next thing we were getting churches and different individuals saying, how can I help? What can we do? We're standing in the middle of Walmart and they're actually cash apping us money to keep buying things. And so from there it just grew. Churches just wanted to know what they could do, how they could step in and help. And so what we ended up being, actually our network, it turned out now that we're actually more of a resource house. Everyone's calling us and asking if I can do this. Like today, someone said that I have a group of women that can make masks if needed. But at the same time, a funeral home call said, we've got all these caretakers and people in the life situations with folks and they need these masks. So we kind of got the two together. And so behind that, we even have churches now stepping up that are doing 50 to 100 meals a day and to give out to the homeless, to supply to those centers so they can give them out to the homeless. And they're steady coming on board with items to help out. And it hasn't stopped there, even to the point now, because there was nothing in place in terms of the homeless population except to send them to the street, that the churches are now coming together and start advocating to the authorities, to the city governments. And even yesterday, someone got a question to the governor at his conference to ask what's going to happen, what's going on with this population, because their hearts are looking at what do we have to do? We have to find a dead homeless person on the street in order to get something to happen within the government. And the answer is pretty simple, even to the point now that the question was posed to us, if each church would volunteer to put up a room that would house 4 to 5 people. We wanted to know, was that possible? So we just started polling the churches, and the churches said absolutely. So we're looking at how to get that implemented at this time, so that we can get the maximum amount of people off of the street. And just prior to that, I guess God knew what was going to happen, so he kind of opened up the opportunity. A contractor and a realtor approached us about opening up houses. They have some houses and they wanted to turn over to us to house the homeless. And so we were trying to figure out how that would happen. And lo and behold, it happened. The churches started stepping up. Churches are now actually furnishing the houses and supplying needs for the homeless that are moving into those houses, and actually interacting in terms of comfort and connecting them back to resources, connecting them back to family, helping them become whole again. So the Hampton Roads Network, City Network, is now daily bombarded with requests. I mean, folks will call, a nonprofit will call and say, I need cleaning supplies, I need this. And we just immediately know who to connect them with or what church, and that church jumps in there and get what they need and supplies their needs immediately. Interesting story, and I won't take my whole time because I know Jim is following me. He needs the time to stretch out. So I had a conversation with a lady a few days ago, and she was saying, I'm just so glad you all are doing what you're doing. I said, and my response to her, well, I'm glad you gave up self for Lent. And so she got really quiet. What do you mean? I'm like, think about what I said. She said, oh, I'm glad I did too. Well, let's keep self out of it for the rest of your life. And so that's what we're finding people doing. They're kind of giving up their whole self thing and the hoarding thing and then sharing. There are people who bought a lot of stuff are now giving it up, giving it back to people that are in need. And one of the things we didn't really look at, a population we didn't look at, and that came about yesterday, social services called and said, we have a pet pantry, but they're running out of supplies, and we've got 70 families, all seniors, they have these pets, and those are the only companions they have in their house. And if they don't get the food, we're gonna have to tell the services, the animal control, to come pick up those pets. And so immediately we just jumped in. And the people didn't have the day, they have all they need for probably the next 6 months. So the churches are really coming together. They're identifying needs. They're seeing that, and even the churches who had elderly population, they were only very much an incline, are finding new purpose in life. They're finding that their work is not done. It's being repurposed to something else. So that's the short of it. So.
Thank you, Charles. And what I love about that story is sometimes we're asking questions about how should our church respond to help our people, and that is really key. And one of the things that you've done is you've taken a step further, and you're saying, how can churches work together and have a conversation about just a tangible need that we can help meet together. So thank you for your leadership, Charles, in Hampton Roads, and you've shown a model of how to connect churches together to serve really tangible needs. We're going to go now to Jim Mullins in Phoenix, and Jim is doing some really creative stuff through Facebook and technology and thinking about the vocational assets in your church. So Jim, would you share with us what you've been doing?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, the Monday after we didn't meet as a corporate gathering, we realized that things were going to change for a long time, more than likely. So we restructured our entire staff into essentially 3 teams. Our connection team, which is basically like, how do you do some sort of community and some sort of connection with one another with these restrictions, care for the community, and then daily discipleship, knowing that the daily life of people is changing pretty drastically, and therefore, how do we help those people reimagine this new season and these new rhythms in light of the biblical story? So the first thing we realized is that there was a rush of new questions that people had. Questions about mental and physical health, questions about finances, questions about educating children, questions about technology. And I think most folks on this call would agree that those are not questions excluded from Christ and his lordship over all things. I'm reminded of James K. Smith's quote that says, Christ is not only Lord of our souls, but also Lord of our bodies, Lord of our families, Lord of our commerce and recreation and education. He's the Lord of science and arts and dance and diphthongs, eating and drinking. There's no corner of creation that's immune from his lordship. And we realized that there were these new questions that people were asking that are very much a part of loving God, loving your neighbor, following Christ, that are under his lordship that we didn't have the answers to. And so we had the option of either suddenly trying to become experts in IT, mental health, financial planning, nutrition, education in just a few days' time, or we could realize that the resources are in the harvest, that there are people in our congregations who have been thinking deeply about these things and can really be a gift, not only to the rest of our church, but to the broader community. And so our role in the body of Christ is now shifted into being functionally the ligaments, the connective tissue that helps connect these different parts of the body together. So one of the main ways we've been doing that is we've been doing a 3 p.m. live stream on Facebook pretty much every day. And we're doing different things, but some of the main things we're doing are facilitating conversations with some of these vocational experts within our church, drawing on their area of expertise. So we've talked with a dietitian, and we even did a cooking demonstration over Facebook Live where she's kind of showing how do you create good, healthy meals out of the stuff that's in your cabinet. We've talked with a PA, a physician assistant, who's on the front lines of caring for those and just kind of doing myth-busting Q&A stuff about coronavirus. We've talked with someone who's been doing homeschooling for a long time to help parents figure out how to do home education, photographer on how to do Lectio Divina or Visio Divina prayer through photography, and a number of other types of folks as well. Basically what we're doing is our role in facilitating this is twofold. One is to actually frame the conversation within the context of the biblical story and highlight the importance of the work that they do, both to serving God, of serving his creation, seeking the flourishing of the city, loving our neighbor. So to frame the conversation and then to just be the person who asks dumb questions, which is really easy for me. I'm not an expert in anything, and I can ask a whole bunch of dumb questions. The questions that everybody else is asking, you get to be the voice for those things. So taking this pastoral role and helping to shepherd your people by being the connective ligaments between the body of Christ and the curator curator of the vocational expertise that our community really needs right now.
Jim, I love that story. And sometimes even the way that we've talked about the title of this webinar is Pastors as Frontline Care Providers. It sounds like we have all the answers, that we need to come up with all the solutions. But what you've really tapped into is what others have said, that we might be pastors, but every single one of the people that comes to our churches are priests. And it's 1 Peter chapter 2, and how do we tap into the priesthood of believers that is part of our congregation for their expertise, their financial coaching, or their the dietitian that you had. What has been the response of people that have engaged with that? Are you seeing the same group of people that are coming back over and over for those, or are there different groups of people depending on their availability or the interest that they have? Or do you and also do you market those opportunities for people to listen in?
Yeah, we share it through our Facebook page, and we've seen probably about a third of our congregation kind of numerically anyway, joins in for those. I think it's the same people every time. I think that there is, and then there's also a crew of people who are from within the community who aren't connected to a church, who are listening in on a lot of these things. I saw the mayor on there the other day. That was kind of interesting. So it's interesting. I will say right now that as odd as it is that we're so separated and we can't be around each other, I do have a sense that people are feeling more connected to the pastoral leadership now than they even were before when things were normal.
I love that picture of you providing these opportunities for your congregation to bless your congregation, but there are people outside of your congregation that are also saying, wow, this is really great content. They're on Facebook anyway, and they're engaging in that. So I really appreciate your thinking in that regards. I'm going to open this question up to all of our panelists. My apologies to everyone tuning in. We've had some Zoom bombing happening, but so we've turned off the chat. But I would like to throw out this question to all of our panelists. As you think about kind of frontline care needs, we've been in this, the first 2, 3, 4 weeks of this pandemic, and this could go on a lot longer. How are you guys thinking about down the road sustaining some of these things? Bill, I was even thinking for you, you're calling out to members of the church, but this may go on for the next 6, 9, 12 months. We just don't know. Are you planning to continue that, or are you thinking about equipping others that could check in, community groups? Where are you guys thinking down the road?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yes to all of that. So we're already kind of calling our community group leaders to a role of saying, would you be proactive in checking in with your people in your group and actually making a push. It might seem odd in this moment, but we kind of do our community groups in a sessions model where we have like a winter, a spring, a fall session. So we're getting ready actually after Easter to launch a new community group session. And we're going to encourage people to join groups virtually if they've never been in a group. So to join a community group, and for some of our folks, their first experience of being in a group is going to be through a Zoom call like this. But that community group structure is really important. It's interesting too, though, as our staff has talked, they've even said, I want to keep, even if we're able to be back together, I'd love to actually not lose this rhythm of calling people on a more regular basis and just checking in on them. Jim, I totally have had the experience that you're having there of feeling, I feel like our congregants feel more connected to us as pastors right now because of those individual touch points and creative things that we're trying to do with social media than in before. And so who knows, even if we're back together meeting like normal, we may have a rhythm of trying to call people on a more regular basis just to check in because of how fruitful that's been.
That's great. Turn it over to Cammie. Anything you guys are thinking about down the road, kind of getting past this first moment of just some triage resources, anything that you guys are planning or thinking about kind of on phase 2 of this?
Yeah, I think each department is really considering it in different ways. Our women's ministry is doing a weekly prayer time and we'll be teaching, via Zoom starting next week. Our youth ministry, we're just using a lot of Zoom technology at this point. We're trying to set up systems that will scale so that if it does go on for, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months more, we're able to keep pace. And I think that, once a lot of our nonprofits get into more of a system, even our local food pantry has changed the way that they're doing things. They're doing more of a drive-through pantry now, and they're open 1 evening a week and 6 mornings a week. And it's just, they're trying to figure out systems that work better with the restrictions that we're all under. So yeah, I think we're definitely in the throes of it right now and just trying to figure out if this isn't working now, it's probably not going to work for 3 or 4 weeks. And so let's try to rethink it and try to come up with a system that'll last more long-term. Because I'm with you. I mean, none of us know how long this is going to go on. So.
That's great. Just give one word to Charles and then one word to Jim, and then we'll wrap up here. But Charles, as you think about what are the needs that maybe the city or the community, what are you hearing in terms of needs that are going to be happening down the line that you're hoping that churches can respond to?
Well, we see the long term, what's going on now is going to kind of replicate itself week after week after week. And that's in terms of the needs of the seniors, the needs of the homeless, the needs of the marginalized. And one of the things we're seeing are pastors are really getting it. They're really seeing their role there. I think something was said in the webinar I was on the other week that pastors are really wealth managers. Because they manage communities, they may manage the churches and assets and properties, and there they're figuring it out, seeing how they can manage all these things and release their folks into the community to take care of others, redefining that work that's taking place, even though they are out of work, on a job, a 9 to 5, but they're redefining the work in terms of the church.
Great. Thank you, Charles. Jim, I'll give you the final word. I'm intrigued about the fact that you guys thought about restructuring your entire pastoral team into these 3 categories, and that how that positions people for the needs that are the current moment, but it also helps define different roles that maybe people are wondering, what am I going to do now? But now they have a pretty clear strategic focus. Can you mention those 3 one more time? And just talk about what a difference that's made for your church?
Absolutely. Yeah, the 3 are, there's really 4 technically, but there's connection. So that's our Sunday morning live stream thing. And then how we're doing communities together. Basically, how are we formally connecting people with each other? That's 1. 2 is care. So these are the people who are doing very similar things that Bill is talking about on the phone every day, are creating structures to help match needs with struggles and problems. And what are we going to do with our campus, talking to the hospitals, those sorts of things. So there's care. The daily discipleship, this is helping to resource people for discipleship in the new realities of everyday life. So we're creating resources like prayer guides. We've got these hand washing prayers where we're having people pray these prayers while they wash their hands and make sure that they wash their hands for more than 20 seconds. But it's also praying for the community, like transforming that moment into an encounter with God, not just getting through it. And then finally, there's the operations team that's just kind of helping all that stuff happen. So that it's a pretty flexible structure that no matter how long this lasts, to what degree you'll need those sorts of things. And we were realizing that we had so many resources put towards Sunday morning sorts of things that now we had a bunch of people who were freed up to help in these other areas, to where our daily whole life discipleship team is now kind of at the front and center of things. And then the other thing I would mention that I think goes along with this is that we're in the process of crafting what we're calling the coronavirus playbook. So basically we're looking at 5 different potential phases that we'll be in with these things. They're not necessarily linear, but that they are different phases or mindsets that you could be in that have certain points of pastoral emphasis and practice. And so we're looking at it as like a playbook, because at any point when things shift, we could say, okay, we're in phase 1, we're in phase 4, we're in phase 3. It helps people shift their mindset and some of the practices they have. And I'll just go over those briefly, then I'll stop talking. So phase 1 is sort of restructure. So having to kind of recreate and innovate. Phase 2 is restriction. So new levels of restriction where people aren't necessarily suffering themselves from the health problems, but more from the restrictions and new rhythms of life. 3 is suffering, where the health issues are hitting people, the financial, economic struggles are hitting people. 4 is something we anticipate seeing is a season of endurance, when it's not the peak of the coronavirus in our area, but it's dragging on through a long summer of restriction and distancing, and it's just wearing people out. And then 5 would be rebuilding, where you address where you build upon the good things that have happened, but also address new idols that we're anticipating emerging and new unhealthy patterns that are emerging. And so at any time, we'll kind of just say, here's what phase we're in, and everyone will know, okay, these are the things we're emphasizing and the pastoral practices we're pushing into.
That's fantastic, Jim. And it sounds like, yeah, you'll have, it's one big playbook, but there are plays for each of those different stages. And so what stage are you saying you're on right now? Is it the second stage?
Yeah, I think we're in the second stage and we're moving toward the third stage as we do start to hear more people testing positive.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
Yeah.
That's great. Is that something that you make publicly available, or maybe we're going to have to get you for a article on that? Because that sounds intriguing. I think a lot of people would be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, I'll share it when we pull it together for sure.
Okay, great. Very good. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists, and we apologize again for the Zoom bombing. We'll take a look at that for next week's webinar and see if we can find a way for there to be more interaction. But we are going to have a webinar again next week, and it's the same time, kind of the same channel. Information is up on our website. And the category that we're talking about next week for common practice is pastoring healthcare workers in the pandemic. We know that all sorts of workers are facing unique challenges and difficult things, but healthcare workers are facing some really unique strains, and how can pastors and churches be particularly present and serve those in the healthcare community as the needs become great in our communities. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Final word that I'll say is this is common practice. If you have things that you are doing with your church, we want to hear those stories. We want to tell those stories in one way or another. So we're so grateful for each of you, and may God bless you as you seek to serve in this really challenging time. But we are the hands and the feet of Christ, and we're thank you for your service during this time. So thank you for attending, everyone.